Hey, it's Jordan. I am here with Thomas Frank, a environmental activist and government agitator in the Indiana area, specifically East Chicago. 2.5 years ago, I believe, East Chicago, which is predominantly African American and Latino, it had lead levels found in exorbitant amounts, particularly in one poor government housing complex that was majority African American. They found lead, arsenic, and not just in that one complex, but citywide, including in the water. So Thomas has been at the forefront of fighting on behalf of, predominantly minority community. And looking now, this was uncovered summer of 2016, so now we're going on year three. A lot of people think that before Trump, the EPA was just wonderful and doing its job, and now, oh, the government shut down. Can you kind of talk about what the government shutdown has meant for East Chicago's cleanup, which I put in loose terms?
Right. What might surprise everybody is that when you're a community of color, an economically disparaged community of color like East Chicago, it's as if the government has been shut down for 40 years. And this recent shutdown by Trump is just another example, more cynical example, of how disparaged communities, vulnerable communities, have been neglected. East Chicago, just a simple example, the EPA has been formed over 45 years ago. It took more than 40 years before they were able to or even willing to consider characterizing the land under which this housing complex, West Calumet Complex, was located. It was always known for those whole 40 years that it was located on top of a lead refinery. So this is just another example. We see the same thing in Flint. We see the same thing in Detroit, whether it's Elkhart, south side of Chicago, Gary, Indiana, or even Rosebud. We just see this reservation. We see this across the country. One of the main problems that we face right now with this government shutdown is that the EPA is, in a way, charged with the public health and welfare when it comes to the environment, how the community interacts with the environment. And to shut down that agency, especially when East Chicago, a community like East Chicago is on health support, life support, really is a hard thing.
And so a meeting was canceled that was supposed to be about the Superfund cleanup. But now, I mean, East Chicago, which I've always said, it's a different circumstance than Flint, but it's just as serious as Flint. I mean, this is like 40, 50 years of lead contamination and other things that was found in the soil, the air, the water. But now in neighboring communities, Hammond and other areas, basically like right next door, they're finding lead. There was, correct me on the number, but I think like 18 or 19 swans that they found dead with high lead levels. That wasn't in a direct drinking water source, but obviously the lead problem is not just East Chicago.
Right. So our neighboring community is Whiting, Indiana, and Hammond. And this is a neighborhood right on the border there between East Chicago, Hammond, and Whiting. And what happened was, if you remember, one of the last things that Scott Pruitt did was he showed up in the back alley of Whiting to declare another Superfund site. There's an active lead refinery right there that had just gotten an air permit, and he declared a Superfund. Everybody was kind of looking for him. I happened to live stream him on Facebook. I found him. What happened there is that the community suddenly became aware that they were being contaminated, that their land was contaminated. And then not only that, but that the responsible party, which is Whiting Metals, had just received an air permit, and they were never allowed to have a public hearing to interfere with that air permit. Now we've discovered two things. First, that the Whiting Metals has been in violation of their air permit, and now we discovered over 24 dead swan that are showing up right adjacent to between the neighborhood and this facility in a cleaned up area. This is land that had already been cleaned up, and so now it's caused the community to be more vigilant and alarmed that maybe even a cleanup isn't even good enough. Maybe they're just throwing soil over it and not really cleaning it up.
So basically, they're basically just dumping more toxic shit on poor people. Am I getting that wrong?
That's exactly it. I mean, we're what we're called the Calumet Industrial Corridor, and we're just another example of where these bad, no good, dirty, polluting projects end up getting concentrated, and whether it was 50 years ago or today.
So, gee golly, I mean, I know the media is never going to cover this on its own because they don't care, but Mike Pence, who by the looks of it potentially could be president one day, soon. He was governor there for 2 terms, correct? So you have, I know that he went lickety split when a white community had a lead problem. He didn't go down to East Chicago. He probably hasn't visited Gary often while he was governor. So
No.
what kind of government action has happened? Obviously, there wasn't much during Mike Pence, but there's a new governor there. Because I know that Governor Holcomb was, kind of verbally talking a little better when he came in after Pence. But have you been seeing real action? Because according to what I'm seeing, like you said, they're talking about cleanup. But how do you thoroughly clean up, decades of contamination?
Right, and that's exactly what we're faced with. We keep getting what's called capping projects. They like to throw a foot or 2 feet of topsoil on top of the contaminants, and what we're trying to get is cleanup. And that's something the responsible parties aren't willing to do, that being the industry that polluted. And then you have the EPA and Indiana Department of Environmental Management, which are acting as brokers between us and the responsible parties. And from our point of view, we're not being heard. That the EPA and IDEM are concerned more with the responsible parties' financial portfolio than with our health and welfare. So we have not gotten the kind of basic needs you would expect in any community.
And also in the immediate complex, West Calumet complex, which again was majority African American, they shut it down. They've done the demolition. This was where lead levels were found, 200 times the quote allowed limit. I know the last time I was there, not every child had been tested. They were basically forcing the last remaining people there into other communities, like just handing them an address. This is where you're going. So, like Flint, there hasn't really been a real accounting of where are these children now. How much lead were they exposed to? What were their levels? Government assistance in terms of, I doubt they're getting Medicare for all, but expanded healthcare treatment. It seems like kind of a lot of these families have been scattered with no real accounting for what their exposure is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the things that they've done is they've just dispersed the community across the country. One of the first things that we demanded the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to do is maintain a registry of all affected population. But we weren't only asking for the 1,200 that were just relocated at this moment. We were asking for the entire population that was affected during the last 40 years, that lived there from 5 to 10 to 20. Some of them lived there for 40 years. We think whether they tested today high in lead doesn't mean that they weren't exposed high levels when they were 1 or 2 when they were crawling on the ground, especially with those high levels. So we're really still fighting for healthcare for all, for life in this affected area. That's still a challenge. And when it comes to the government agencies, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, they're still pointing fingers at each other, trying to find ways out of liability. And that's been a problem for us.
Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting because you see now the Green New Deal movement. And I know you've been an environmentalist way before this. And a lot of focus is on stopping climate change. And obviously, they can only put so much in their portfolio. But there's not as much focus on the damage, not just to the planet, but to communities, I'm like screaming into a cave still reporting on Flint or East Chicago because it really doesn't get much. I know the Northwest Times there, a local outlet, has followed up. But there really isn't much talk about communities from Flint, to East Chicago, to North Carolina, which has a water crisis.
Right.
And every day it's like there's stuff popping up in Ohio, Massachusetts, Florida. I don't need to tell you. So, like you said, the government seems mostly focused on big business and making sure that they slap them on a risk. And I also wanted to ask you, it seems that instead of rebuilding affordable housing, they're trying to develop, economic development in the housing that was shuttered because of the lead.
Yeah, so this is ironic. So in East Chicago, because we're one of the most industrial cities in the country and perhaps the world, in the last 2 decades, 20 years, we've had 3 neighborhoods demolished because of different kinds of contamination because of industry. And when they demolished West Calumet, we've got the mayor to commit to redevelopment towards housing. But when it came to just recently, he just sent a letter to the EPA saying that he wants to redevelop the land for industrial uses. And that's a real problem for us because we're constantly being cannibalized by industry. Only 17%, or less than 17% now, of East Chicago is dedicated to housing. More than 80% is dedicated to industrial uses. And much of that, about 40% of that, is out of use because of its contamination. So this is a real problem that we face. We need to do some real serious cleanups. When it comes to Green New Deal, we're all for that. We happen to be a community that has the largest tar sands refinery in the U.S., that's BP, which was originally Standard Oil, and that's the Rockefellers. What we're really not happy is that the Rockefellers are able to go out and fund green projects. They're able to go fund green and climate change, anti-climate change movies and documentaries, and divest of fossil fuels while they leave the contamination back here for us to deal with. We have more than 16.8 million gallons of oil floating on our water table that the Rockefellers left behind with Standard Oil. They aren't coming back and cleaning up their mess. And that's something we really want to hold their feet to the fire for, is they're responsible for this degradation on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. And they need to fix that.
It's interesting you brought that up, and you probably know of plenty other plutocrats that are kind of
Yes.
caught in their own hype. Because Bill Gates, for example, he's done a lot of climate change. He's put out there as the humanitarian and yada yada. But I've reported on toxic landfills that his waste management company owns, and that they will not. In St. Louis area, there's a toxic waste field that Bill Gates' investment company owns, and
Right.
Bill Gates personally withdrew his stock in this, but then his investment company just bought up the stocks that he withdrew, and this is, I think it's the Bridgeton landfill that is right next to a underground methane fire, where I've been in St. Louis. They have children going out to play in masks. I went to this landfill. I had a mask on, and it didn't even do anything because the stench. It is between the landfill, very close up to the underground methane fire. Firefighters there have said we could go to work on it, but they haven't been allowed to. The EPA has not done studies on how close the landfill is to the nuclear waste. So basically, Bill Gates. He plays a part in that. Warren Buffett, CNBC might as well fetishize the man. He's the largest investor in the Dakota Access Pipeline. So this is a long-winded way of saying a lot of the plutocrats enshrined in the corporate media Hall of Fame are actually part of the toxic legacy in communities like East Chicago.
That's exactly so. And we're seeing that again and again. It's so many. We got Warren Buffett, who owns the rail lines here, and many of our land. We used to have a tanker. They used to build tank cars here in East Chicago, and he abandoned that. Though he still owns the land, and it's heavily contaminated. And it's been left behind. We just have so many examples of these big oligarchs. American oligarchs. We don't have to talk about the Russian oligarchs and that Trump is, in cahoots with Russia. We have American oligarchs that have been in cahoots with Russia and other countries, and many other countries as they've globalized. And this is how they've abandoned communities here in the United States. They have damage in the ground, they have damage in the water and in the air, and they aren't addressing it.
Well, let me ask you because East Chicago, essentially, this was decade long in the making, but it's now spreading to not so poor communities. I mean, you see water problems in middle class neighborhoods in Michigan, PFOA and PFAS. I still can't pronounce what it means, but these are cancer-causing chemicals that they found in Michigan. Oh, Governor Snyder, before he left, he got on that lickety-split. Flint had to wait 18 months. But the point is, the basically industrialization happened not, 50, 60, 70 years ago in these poorer communities, but the effects are now spreading to middle-class communities, white communities, and it seems like the response is quite different by the politicians in those communities.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's the case. But what we're seeing is when it comes to their drinking water, we industrialize our water systems with lead pipes across the country, but also especially here in Chicagoland area. So it's affected whites, browns, black communities across our region. We happen to be a clarion call. We were able to call them out on it and try to get something done. We still have a long ways to go. My concern, we know that middle class and upper middle class and wealthy communities will find solutions. We are trying to fight for low income, or let's say economically disparaged communities, in how to find solutions for them. And that's a huge challenge.
So let me ask you, we did reporting in Flint over the summer on basically the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality cooking the data. Can't get into details, but right now it's in the background being looked at by the new administration, so that's good.
I think we found that same thing in Milwaukee as well.
Yes, shocker. If you let the very agencies causing the contamination then do the testing, they generally find the numbers are just dandy. Anyway, I bring that up because when we were knocking on all these doors, we knocked on 450 doors. I mean, you couldn't go a block without finding out that this one just died of cancer, this one's dying, and not old people, like people in their 40s, people in their 50s. I haven't had the funding to knock on doors in East Chicago, but after the news got out of this decades-long contamination, people were starting to connect some dots, and people were like, oh, I always wondered why all the other women in my age group around here were having the same issues, and upper respiratory, bronchitis, cancers with no family history. Obviously, you don't have the pulse on the whole community, but you're in enough little pockets. Have people been, as this crisis came out in 2016, are more people realizing that their illnesses might have been caused by this?
Right. In East Chicago, when we broke the Superfund story, we were able. That was one of the biggest things that came out of this was positive. Is that neighbors started talking to each other, and they started realizing that there was a pattern there in terms of their health and their conditions and their children's conditions. And that's something that has triggered them to pursue this. We're finding the exact same thing happening in Whiting and Hammond as well, and that Superfund. It's called the Federated Metals Superfund site. And they're starting to talk to each other, and they're realizing in this Superfund site, or even right outside of it, there has a tremendous high level of dementia and other issues. And they're beginning to talk to each other. This is something that families held secretive for a long time. But now they're beginning to talk, and this pattern is really alerting them to some really serious problems that they're scared about. Mm-hmm. And they're scared that they placed their children in harm's way. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I happen to benefit from a little bit is that my children also tested very, very high in lead, extraordinarily high, 27 parts per million or milligrams per deciliter. About 10 years before we were able to break open the story in the Superfund site. And that's one of the reasons why I started doing these toxic tours and starting to alert the community. So the trauma that we went through, my wife and I, in trying to address it, is what the trauma that people in the Superfund site, in East Chicago in general, in Gary, in Whiting, and Hammond are just beginning to go through. And it's not easy.
So let me ask you a 360-degree question that has nothing to do, well, it does, but kind of broader. So under Trump, there has been, obviously, if you ask me, I mean, Trump's terrible, but he's not George W. Bush. We've kind of sanitized George W. Bush because America has very short-term memory. But racism is so viscerally out there because of his words, his policies, this and that, and people kind of look at the Democratic Party as like, oh, they're anti-Trump and they're better than Trump. But a lot of these policies that, they're not tweeting racist things from the Democrats sound nice. They go to the black churches and rah, rah, rah. I've seen it. But their policies are not, are just as devastating in a lot of areas because they're bought off by big business too. They're just kinder in the way they talk, and they're more, I would say, they're more silently damaging African American communities. But when I say that, I'm talking down to black people, or I'm explaining to black people. I've seen this on Twitter. I said, hey, Joe Biden, he drafted the crime bill, which kind of caused mass incarceration, and I'm racist for saying that. So you've been on the front lines of all this environmental activism. Is the answer just to throw any Democrat in the White House to get rid of Trump? Is that going to help East Chicago, Flint, these other places we're talking about?
Not at all. So this is a working class community, and we've been a Democratic stronghold for as far as memory can even think of. What we've gone through in those last 40 years is the neoliberal era, and I think they just kind of resulted in a Trump. They've been moving and drifting to the right. The Democratic Party is a right-wing party. They are a capitalist party, not unlike the Republicans. They just have a different set of corporations than the Republicans have. The Republicans are much more invested in fossil fuel, the Koch brothers. The Democrats are invested in Google and some of the high-tech industries. And we're going to find some contamination issues there. We've been neglected for those 40 years under the EPA, under Democratic rule, for these last 40 years. And it didn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democrat in office. So, yeah, it does matter. I've been somebody that's been trying to push ourselves further to the left to individuals that are actually meeting, I don't want to say individuals, movements that are actually meeting to address the problems that we face. There is no people power. At this moment, with the EPA, for example, when we have meetings, they come to the residents last. They have at least 8 or 9 other stakeholders and interests, and whether it's the previous responsible party, the corporation, whether it's the state, whether it's the EPA that's trying to mitigate against their liabilities, whether it's the city or the landowner. And each one of these interests are trying to cherry pick voices from the community to do their work for them. We, in the Calumet Lives Matter, have been organizing the whole community to give voice to them and to fight with people power. We try not to put an interest ahead of the people's interests. And that's something we're starting to see growing in our region. It's not been easy, but our entire region, we're starting to see that. And I think if we're not looking to organize around electoral politics. We're looking to build movements, and that where people are able to take responsibility for themselves. So when there's a candidate, it's a candidate that comes from a movement, that we've pushed them forward, or that group pushed them forward. Not that an individual comes here and just starts talking, saying, oh, I'm for you. Right. We want to have a track record of work behind us. We've seen that with Bernie Sanders. We've seen that with Ocasio-Cortez. She was pushed forward by the Democratic Socialists of America because of the work that she had been doing. We're seeing that in communities around the country, even in Indiana. So I've never seen this kind of organizing. So in one sense, it's been positive.
Well, what's interesting going to Indiana, so Joe Donnelly, when he lost by a good amount, he said, well, the reason he lost, you can't win in Indiana on Medicare for all and these things. Well, Bernie Sanders won the Indiana primary. So, yeah, Indiana is generally conservative, but I think we're starting to realize that if certain candidates can talk to more traditionally conservative people in the language that they understand, gee, Medicare for All is pretty damn popular now. It's at 70%. Free public college is at 60%. A Green New Deal is at 81%. So I think there's a lot more working class people out there and, subconscious progressive people than people realize. Your thoughts?
I completely concur. I mean, we saw de Blasio make the announcement this last week that he wants to provide health care for all for those residents in New York City. I'm not certain the details of that, but he's including immigrants. He's including unemployed people.
By the way, that affects me. My health care is running out. I'm on COBRA. I think I only have a few months left. Yeah.
That is a wonderful. That's a way to retain power within your community, and that helps the community and helps residents to be able to organize community. If they don't have to work so hard, 2 jobs just to get health care, they can then set up public meetings, they can talk to each other, they can take care of their family, they can do a lot of things. It's a start. It's not. It's a human right, and it's a start to addressing this wrong that's been there for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to make a point to something you said before. The Republicans, it's more of a clear line to the fossil fuel industry. But a lot of people don't realize the Democrats basically indentured servitude to Wall Street. Wall Street's heavily invested in a lot of these fossil fuel projects. Wall Street's heavily invested in companies like Dow Chemical and this and that. So I happen to know from conversations I've had, these Democrats, it might not be that they're taking money from ExxonMobil directly, but they are very much looking for money from Wall Street, and Wall Street likes the Warren Buffetts of the world, the Bill Gates of the world, and these kinds of companies that have done so much damage to East Chicago. Last question about East Chicago. So one thing I've seen is when these events come to the national forefront, and unfortunately, I did everything I could, but I don't think East Chicago was treated the same way Flint was. You didn't even have the swarm of all the cameras for a week, which happened in Flint, and then they all went away. You didn't even have that in East Chicago. But I think people kind of originally, in the beginning, there's a real energy among residents and activists coming together. They're angry, they're galvanized, they're trying to figure out what they could do. And then, as the government basically lets them fend for themselves, people kind of become more hopeless. Residents, there's like resident on resident squabbles, and the movement, we've seen it in East Chicago and other places, for environmental justice kind of, fades a little bit because people just say, well, this is what it is. It's an oligarchy. It's an American empire, and they're just going to leave us to die. What's been the energy now in East Chicago? Are people still, other than you, fighting? Because the cleanup, like you said, isn't really a full cleanup. There's not even discussion, as far as I know, about like a Medicare for all on the local level for people that have been damaged by this.
I think what we had for the first year and a half is that we had a lot of people organizing quickly and fast, and the community came out. It's hard to sustain that level for so long unless there is a system in place that can sustain them to keep coming out. We've seen some ebbs and flows, but the community is still organizing against and for themselves when it comes to the Superfund site. And we are spreading. This is a whole corridor of industry. And so we're moving into other communities in addressing other issues as well. So there are many, many groups that are forming. It is hard. One of the hardest things that we face is, especially when Scott Pruitt was EPA chief, he had what he called this Superfund czar, Albert Kelly. And Albert Kelly would come to East Chicago constantly, and he would try to cherry pick individuals. He would try to deal with an individual and give them rewards, one over another, and started to seed a lot of that discontent.
Divide and conquer.
Yes, we saw a lot of that, and we had to work through that. Our community is divided, and I wish it wasn't. Everybody wishes that there'd be a united, but I think that's okay. Each interest can fight for themselves as long as those are community interests. What we find is that these big powers like to step in and use the community, and they'll float some dollars to an individuals that will fight their fight for them, and that's been the most difficult thing.
And on top of lead, like you were talking about, there's now basically they're dumping PCBs onto the community.
Right. This is the thing that I've been trying to bring more and more attention to. Is 2 days before the EPA, or I'm sorry, the federal government shut down, the EPA and IDEM announced that they were approving an Army Corps of Engineers permit to create the largest PCB dump in the country right next to our high school. And that's caused us the last month not to be able to respond to anybody. There's nobody in the government to respond to. So this is something that we feel is very, very cynical. And this is unlike the Superfund site where we're trying to fight against and get something cleaned up. This is something that's doing additional harm to the community, and especially the most vulnerable, our children. And so we're really looking to try to blow that fight out.
And you can do better justice than I can, but PCBs they're human carcinogens. They can cause cancer. Right. In addition to a lot of other things. So what was the rationale they gave for dumping it on East Chicago, which literally is trying to barrel its way out of essentially lead poisoning?
So this is hilarious. This is an absolutely cynical thing. They told us that none of the responsible parties, or let's say, and none of the businesses that utilize the canal wanted to pay for taking those PCBs somewhere else or cleaning them up, neutralizing them. Their argument is that nobody wanted to pay for it. Well, why would somebody voluntarily want to pay for it? We do know that somebody's responsible for those PCBs there. We can go to those responsible parties and say, you have to pay for it. Here, they're just telling us, and this is the EPA, our so-called Democratic heroes in this fight against Trump, are telling us that nobody wants to pay for it. So we can't force them. We don't want to force them to pay for it. And so it has to go next to your high school.
So let me ask you, because I've actually been curious about this myself. So if you want to look up a politician nationally, you go to like opensecrets.org and you see who they're taking money from. But the EPA, it's not like a direct donation relationship where the EPA gets donations from Exxon. But right. The EPA essentially, it seems, works for business. So why is that? This has been long before President Trump. So why is that? Is that because the overall government is bought off? So the EPA, by extension, its marching orders are, put some regulations in there, but don't upset business.
Well, it's a complicated thing. There are a lot of very good rank and file workers that mean very well and want to do as much as they can under the constraints that they have. And then there are all the political appointees. And then there is also all what we call regulatory capture, where industry has placed their own people in the regulatory agencies in the EPA to do their bidding for them. And so the EPA is a very complex entity now. It's hard to figure out who's who and who's on your side. And that's been a problem. Good. So the EPA was formed in 1972. And in East Chicago, where we had over 100 years of industrialization, they weren't going to give up power to the EPA that easy. So what East Chicago did, and what the industries did here, is they formed their own environmental department. So for the first 20 years of the EPA, in East Chicago, Gary and Hammond had their own environmental departments which issued permits and did enforcement. Of course, there were no enforcement acts. So it wasn't until 1992 that they shut down those departments. In 1988, IDEM, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, formed and took over those responsibilities. So there's been this handoff of interest. So now, if you know IDEM, it's basically an economic development tool. They don't see themselves as being responsible for the protection of the environment and the community.
And just so people know, IDEM is essentially Indiana's EPA.
It's Indiana's EPA, and one of the things to kind of remember is Pence. Pence, his family used to own an oil company called Kyle Oil. They had more than $8 million of environmental damage, and instead of addressing that, they decided to declare bankruptcy and never clean up what their damage was. Pence, whose brother is Greg Pence, just was elected to the Congress. When they shut down their oil company, Mitch Daniels, who was governor at that time, appointed him the number 2 man at IDEM. So they had $8 million of environmental damage. They shut down their company, and he gets appointed to head of IDEM. And he was the efficiency czar. And now he's a congressman in Congress.
You know, this was a great segue to my final question. So I see Tom Steyer, he's doing his commercials to impeach Donald Trump. Obviously, there's a huge, not just natural movement to impeach him, but kind of a money-making movement as well. I'm no cheerleader for Donald Trump, but I've always said be careful what you wish for, because I think Mike Pence is a much more radical, competent man who is in lockstep with the Republican Party, much more competent as far as legislation, maneuvering. I don't think you'd really see this government shutdown with a President Pence. Frankly, I think you could have got rid of Obamacare under a President Pence. You're living in Indiana. I've interviewed people on Pence there. What are your thoughts for the people that want to impeach Donald Trump? What would a President Pence look like?
I would say beware. President Pence is probably going to be your nightmare. He has relationships in government. He has relationships with with corporate interests. He knows how to accomplish things. He's competent in that respect. He was able to do it in Indiana. And
by the way, not to interrupt you, but Indiana ranks at the top of least environmental regulation.
Exactly. I mean, for many reasons. I always call Indiana the most northern southern state in the Union. We literally miss the bandwagon in the early 19th century, the progressive era. So our Constitution doesn't really have rights, human rights, that it's based on. These are a lot of corporate interests that have always had control. And we have a huge hurdle to overcome. And Pence has been able to maximize the legal framework that we live in. And that's been a problem for us.
And he's also, as far as I could see, a really, really radical Christian fundamentalist.
Yes.
So when you're talking about all these things popping up, LGBT rights, obviously black and brown people getting more involved in politics, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we just got the first 2 Muslim women elected to Congress. Mike Pence isn't exactly like going to be right out at those congratulatory or protests on behalf of those types of people.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, we're in a difficult time. But I am, with all due respects, the Trump administration has created a blowback, and I'm starting to see organizing with the Democratic Socialists and others that are growing their base, and I think that's been positive. And so far as we're going to be able to continue to do that. So, an impeachment of Trump, I'm not certain that's going to be the best thing for the country.
And my last question, I know I said that 3 questions ago. How could people in their communities who might not actively know if there's a water problem, a soil problem, a lead problem, how do people kind of protect themselves? Is it they contact their water departments or environmental agencies and ask, what are you testing for? How do people get information? Because I can tell you, I know you know this, water problems are nationwide, and you might not know it's a problem now, but it's very likely there's been some type of legacy pollution in your community.
Right. I wouldn't ask for tests. They've been passing over and over despite the problems. What I would do is I'd ask your government officials, your city and state, is what's the infrastructure? Is it lead-based, pipes? That is something to ask about. We do know that in Indiana we've got over $3.2 billion of lead-based pipes in the state that needs to be remediated or replaced. And that, I think, will give you the clue what's the problem is. You definitely want to filter your water, especially if you have an older infrastructure. So I think if I was just to say one thing, it's just to know what is the infrastructure.
Yeah. Thank you for taking the time. When I get the funding, I think I'm going to have to take your toxic tour. I never took it in Indiana. Thanks, Thomas.
All right, thank you so much.
Cool.